Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Joseph S. Samaniego. I'm the author of the Carolingian Age fantasy book series, and I am here with another history reaction video. These are actually kind of fun, and this is going to be a fun one for this Friday. And it's something that's actually been in my books quite a bit because it's something that I have. Maybe content warning, but we're going to be talking about beer. So beer is an important element in history for a lot of reasons. And we're probably going to explain some of these here. I have not seen this video, so hopefully I won't repeat commentary that they have. However, it is a very historical drink. So in this video, we were going to see a little bit of that. But in my books, we also talk about ales and beers and things like that because it was a common drink for a lot of people in the Middle Ages and in ancient history. So it's one of those it's not perhaps the most common thing, but when you're reading my books, you will hear parties and they will have festivals and feasts and gatherings. And so they'll talk about beer or mead or ale. And so this is what we're going to kind of focus on today. So let's check this out. The history of beer.
This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream. Get access to Nebula, a video streaming service made by your favorite educational creators when you sign up for CuriosityStream.
And I'm drinking coffee right now
in the description.
So probably another.
Cheers! Tasty. There's nothing quite like a refreshing pint of beer. But did you know that there is 10,000 years of history in this glass? Beer has been poured since prehistory, slurped by hunter-gatherers and pyramid builders, pharaohs, Vikings, the Inca and the Irish, chugged from jugs, horns, skulls, steins and even through golden straws.
Okay, so it's kind of funny that the Viking was like beating up on the Irish monk as he was drinking his beer. But yeah, so beer has been a mainstay of human diet and cuisine for thousands of years. It was part of a currency at one point. So you would get paid in beer sometimes.
Used to pierce through a warm, crusty yeast cake. Yeah, crusty yeast cake. We'll get to that. So,
Yummy.
What is the history of beer? How did it save humanity? And can a hangover be a religious experience? Well, let's find out.
Yeah, I mean, there's been times I'm like, oh God, when I get hungover. So yeah, I can see a religious experience with that.
Our story begins a long, long time ago. At least as far back as 13,000 years ago, people in the Levant and Turkey were making beers for feasts and rituals by fermenting wild grains. This is before humans settled down and started farming. Beer is essentially liquid bread. To make either, you mix grain like barley, wheat or rice with water and leave it to ferment. Grains ferment because of yeast, tiny single-celled fungi that are everywhere. These little buddies turn the sugars in the grains into alcohol. If you leave out some mushed up grains, wild yeasts will find them and start fermenting. Wild yeasts have a very particular set of skills. They will find you and they will ferment you. If you make a dough from the fermented mush and bake it, you'll get bread.
So I guess if nothing else, the meme quality that we get from what was it, Taken, Liam Neeson's films, or that will stay with us forever. So that's pretty awesome.
A more soupy version becomes beer.
Yep.
Academics used to think humans settled down and started farming to secure a steady supply of grain to make bread. But, and it's a big but, hunter-gatherers had a better diet, shorter workdays and healthier lives than early farmers. Why would humans swap their chill, hunter-gatherer lives to become hard-working, mostly bread-eating farmers? If bread was a convincing reason to start doing civilization, then ducks would have beaten us to it. Maybe, and it's a big maybe, 10,000 years ago, hunter-gatherer groups routinely came together to party and drink beer they made from wild grain. Then they realized they could secure a steady supply of grain to make beer if they stayed in one place and just farmed grains. beer and the festivals that come along with it might have convinced hunter-gatherers to settle down in cramped towns and work long, grueling days on farms under the rule of kings, pharaohs, and priests.
So that's, yeah, like you said, it's a maybe. It's a big maybe, as he said. The other aspect that you really got to look at with hunter-gatherers is they were nomadic, and they followed the herds, they followed the water. So if there was ever a drought, they would have to go to another area, which meant that they were already consuming their stores and their own energy to do so. Same with following the herds. Same with following, if you're following the wild wheats and the wild fruits. When you settled in some place, however, you could manipulate the land to provide. You could store your own water. You could create irrigation. Irrigation is actually a pretty old science as well. So there's a lot of what ifs, and we don't really know for 100% certainty why hunter-gatherer societies stopped hunting and gathering and started to farm. It did lead to what you would consider a harder lifestyle with farming. However, it was a more stable lifestyle. And even with farming, their work year was less than what we would work because, yeah, during the harvest time, it was heavy, loaded work days. But if there wasn't anything to harvest, you kind of just maintained your land. So it was a little easier during those time periods in retrospect to their harvest time. So we don't know the full answer, but this is actually a pretty cool possibility because of the fact that it gives another reason for the social dynamic of coming together.
These first
and in the social dynamic, I should point out also that there's more trade and more economic growth that can happen because now you're together so that you can start making more money or whatever currency you use at that point.
Farmers in Mesopotamia now had to seed, plough, and maintain the land. Communities had to come together to build infrastructure like irrigation canals for their crops. Once the grain grew, they had to learn how to store, process, and distribute it, which led to writing and governments and militaries to protect those grains. And maybe, I don't know, steal some other people's grains. And to force the remaining hunter-gatherers to become farmers too. And boom, now you've got civilization. Learning how to manage a grain surplus is essentially what civilization is. So maybe our craving for beer created civilization as we know it. Beer and bread quickly became the symbols of civilized people. The ancient Sumerians wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh around the 3rd millennium BCE. In it, we learned the story of Enkidu, a wild...
Yeah, and what's interesting about the Epic of Gilgamesh is that there's also references to a great flood in there, and as there is in other cultures. Just point out there. Just saying.
Wild man who lives outside of civilization. The city-living king Gilgamesh decides to civilize Enkidu, and so sends Shamhat, a temple prostitute, to tame him. After spending some days together, Shamhat says, "Eat the bread, Enkidu. It is the way one lives. Drink the beer, as it is the custom of the land." He ate the food, and then he drank the beer, 7 jugs, and turned into a human. It was beer and bread that turned Enkidu from a wild man into a proud Sumerian citizen. Possibly a metaphor for what happened to the Sumerians themselves. The Mesopotamians and Egyptians brewed dark beer, light beer, beer for the rich and the poor, and for the living and the dead, and many others we still can't translate. In Egypt, tombs were filled with a special kind of beer that would not turn sour, so that the dead could enjoy it in the afterlife.
Okay, so we're going to go to Egypt and find that beer because that sounds delicious. Beer that won't turn sour. All right.
We see this in the tomb of King Scorpion I, who lived in the 3200s BCE.
And this particular king, King Scorpion, is actually considered to be one of the first, really the first true king of Egypt. I think there might have been some legendary ones before him, but this is one of the first or one of the oldest examples of of pharaohs, I guess, or of Egypt that we have physical evidence of.
This Scorpion King was buried with over 2,000 vessels.
See the rock back there?
Ordinary dead Egyptians only had a few small jars of beer to enjoy after death. We didn't discover what yeast was until the 1800s, and so for the first farmers, the transformation
And Pasteur was also the one who discovered about milk pasteurization.
of grains into beer must have seemed magical and connected to the gods. Beer shows up across Egyptian mythology. The god Osiris brought brewing to humans. Another myth tells us that one day Ra was furious because he thought humanity was plotting against him. He sends his daughter, the goddess Hathor, to punish the people by killing them and drinking their blood. And she does an amazing job at murdering everyone. Just look at her go. Ra realized that there would soon be no humans left to worship him, and so he tricked his daughter into drinking red dyed beer. Thinking it was blood, Hathor chugged the beer and then passed out. She eventually woke up with a peaceful heart and stopped her rampage. So technically, humanity was saved by beer. Hathor became tightly associated with beer. The Egyptians dedicated a holiday to her, the Tek Festival, the festival of drunkenness. During these celebrations, people would drink as much as possible while dancing and singing until they fell asleep.
Playing beer pong.
Then in the morning, priests would sneak into the party hall with a massive statue of Hathor and then wake up the partiers with loud drums. This sudden sobering up in the goddess's presence was supposed to produce a spiritual connection and probably one hell of a hangover.
Yeah, so if you ever are woken up the next morning with a bunch of drums banging by your head, yeah, that's definitely a fun experience.
In Samaria, Ninkasi was the goddess of beer, and women were the primary beer brewers. Sumerian beer was a thick, froth.
And that's actually a theme that you see throughout history for a long time, is that most of the brewing was done by women. It was very similar to baking, to bread making, in that mindset of occupation. It was a very important occupation. But the brewing was done a lot by the women in society, and so it was something that was. I don't know if that was like a gender role or anything like that. I don't want to speculate on that, but we just do know from historical records that a lot of the major brewers up until the Renaissance really were women, or breweries were run by women.
Drunk by several people out of the same jug. Both the Mesopotamian cuneiform character and the Egyptian hieroglyph for beer are these little beer jugs, which is just adorable. They
That's
drank
cute,
these beers immediately after brewing when it was fresh. Each person had their own straw made from reed, or if you were really rich, gold. They used the straws to poke through the thick, crusty yeast cake that formed on top of the warm, fermenting beer. The straws also helped filter out any bits that were floating in the beer. Here you can see an Egyptian drinking beer using the world's first crazy straw. Also, here is a 3,200-year-old Egyptian painting of a hippo making beer. Why? I don't know. You need to see this. Warm, chunky beer might not sound nice to us, but they were very nutritious. Ancient beer was a good source of vitamins B6 and B12, minerals, antioxidants, and even fiber.
No.
This made up for the lack of meat and vitamins in farming people's diets. In Egypt, pharaohs and nobles.
Yeah, so the diet of a lot of people, and this is up for generations and thousands of years after the Egyptians, but the diets of most commoners would have been something along the lines of grain stores or rice, porridges, things like that. You wouldn't have had a lot of meat in your diet except on special occasions, or depending on what you could afford or what you could catch yourself, depending on the laws and restrictions. Obviously, like in medieval England, you couldn't go out and hunt your own deer because that was illegal. All the deer belonged to the king. You would catch rats, or you would catch smaller animals, rabbits, things like that. You could catch fish, But at the same time, you would also look at what is economical, and you could sell some of those things too. So a lot of the diet was primarily grain, and that's one reason why beer making was so important, because this was what you could do with the grain to also make it last longer.
Drank elaborate, spiced, and sweetened beers. The workers got a simpler version.
Craft beer.
In Samaria, women working in temples were paid 2 liters of beer daily, whereas children only got 1 liter. The Code of
So there you go. That's one example of current beer as currency.
Hammurabi of Eye for an Eye fame had laws regulating the price of beer, and the workers who built the pyramids of Giza were paid in beer. Not just beer, obviously, but it was a part of their wages. To pay all those workers, Egypt needed to produce a lot of beer. One large brewery we've discovered produced 40,000 pints of beer at a time. Just south of the Egyptians, Sudanese Nubians used fermenting beer to create antibiotics. During the fermentation process, they produced the antibiotic tetrasaline and used it to treat bacterial infections 2,000 years before Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. All the way over in China,
Okay, so I've always said that beer has healing properties, and so I guess I was right.
earliest finds of beer making are from 7000 BCE, and it was probably fermented from rice, berries, and honey. During the Shang dynasty, the palace had its own official brewers, and taverns popped up in large cities. Di Xin, the last emperor of the Shang dynasty, might have liked beer a little too much. One of his parties had a lake of beer and a meat forest, and he made men and women chase each other about quite naked, and had drinking bouts the whole night long. The people
I never heard about the meat forest, although that sounds heavenly. I did read once about his lake of beer. That actually I have read about, and the drunken escapades that followed. Yeah, that's just one of the extravagance that you see with emperors from all over the world and all over cultures.
eventually turned on him, and the royal palace with Di Xin inside of it was burned. The Shang dynasty soon collapsed, and many people blamed it on the drinking. Up in Scandinavia, beer and mead, a drink made from fermented honey, played an important part in diplomacy, marriages, and funerals. Communal drinking from a single cup was also a thing. They even had these cool triple cups to make things easier. This helped Norse people build strong social bonds with each other. Some Norse warriors known as berserkers, which means bear shirt, were said to enter a sort of trance to increase strength during battle. Scholars think they did this by mixing psychoactive plants into their beer or mead, which did pump them up for battle, but also caused hallucinations, delirium, seizures, comas, and sometimes death.
And we've talked about berserkers in the Battle of Hastings reaction video. That they would do things to increase their adrenaline and to increase their rage to go into battle. And yeah, it's really just like adding anything to your drink like that could have very negative effects to you, to anybody.
Some researchers believe that the berserker hallucinogenic might have been henbane. This plant was found all across European archaeological sites, like Skara Brae, a Neolithic site and ancient brewery from around 3000 BCE. The Celts also seem to have used henbane in their beer. Unfortunately, most of what we know about Celtic beer comes from Roman sources, who hated beer. But the wine-loving Romans have more to do with beer than you might think.
And a lot of what we have from Celts comes from burial sites, and as you said, Roman sources, which paints a very one-sided picture of the Celts. But we do have burial sites as well that have given us image pictures. I don't believe we have much written, because I don't think the Celts had a written, any lot of written documentation, written language. I could be wrong. Correct me if I am, but I don't believe so.
The English word beer comes from the word beer from old Germanic languages, which might come from an even older Germanic word, biora. But other scholars believe beer got into Germanic via the Latin word bevere, which means a drink or a beverage. Today, most countries use a word that sounds like beer. But Spanish speakers decided to go and be awkward and use cerveza, which came from the language of the beer-hating Romans, Latin, and probably comes from the name of the Roman goddess of growth, Ceres, which is where the word cereal comes from, or from a Celtic word for beer that morphed into cervisia and then into cerveza. In early English, ale was the
Yeah, you got to remember that beer being from grain, that makes sense to come from, this is similar to how the Egyptians kind of associated a goddess with beer. The Romans associated it with another goddess. Romans were famous for kind of stealing ideas like that too, religious ideas.
common word for beer,
I'm sorry, adapting.
and is still the word for beer in Scandinavia as öl and the Baltics as alus. Beer only took over from ale as a word in English later on. With the fall of the beer-hating Roman Empire in the 5th century CE, the invasion of the Germanic tribes and the rise of the Catholic Church, beer gained a new role in everyday European life. One Catholic bishop noted while visiting the Rhine River region that the people drank like madmen, and that one has to thank the Lord to survive their drinking bouts. The church was hopeless about getting them to quit their mad drinking, so it embraced it instead. They matched the pagan festivities to Christian holidays, pairing traditions like Germanic Yule with Christmas, or bonfire solstice rituals with St. John's Day, and then monks became some of the best beer brewers.
Yeah, you can actually still get some of the beers brewed by monks, by Trappist monks. I think in Belgium there's a big communities of monks that still brew beer. It's pretty famous, actually. The other aspect of that they talked about is, Christianity, and Constantine did this, a few others after him, the popes did this. As an effort to convert people, they started utilizing the familiar pagan holidays, such as Yule, such as Roman holidays, and just kind of combining them with Christian holidays, or what they wanted to be Christian holidays. And that's a very simple explanation of it, because it's more than just, hey, we're going to combine these holidays. They took bits and pieces from all of them. Even the halos that you see here come from Egyptian religious aspects of Ra. But then there's also, it goes even further back to Paul telling people as he's trying to convert them that no, you can keep your traditions. You don't have to do these things, such as giving up pork, other aspects of Judaism, like Peter and some of the other apostles were doing. He was basically telling people, you keep your traditions, you just pray to you just follow the words of Jesus, and you pray to this particular God, as opposed to the gods the pantheon that you have used to, but you keep your traditions. And it made it easier to convert people that way. Same with the holidays. And we know Christmas was a very raucous holiday in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, even up into the around 17th century, 17th, 18th century. It was not a family-esque holiday. It was you went out, you got drunk, you partied. It was a day off of work, and it was a day to go get drunk and get party and get wasted and have a grand old time.
Christian monks also travelled a lot, and it's thanks to the Flemish monk William of Rubruck that we know that the Mongols drank in style. In 1253, William entered Karakorum, the capital city of the Mongol Empire at that time.
And this is important because he actually was one of the first Europeans to witness the Mongol Empire. And he was one of the first we have a lot of documentation of Marco Polo's expedition. But Williams was actually just as important, if not more important, for not only the timing of it, but some of the more primary sources that we have. Whereas Marco Polo had a little bit more fanciful tales to tell and kind of ascribed a lot of some supernatural aspects to some of his stories, Williams was a little bit more matter of fact. And it actually helped bring Christianity or a sect of Christianity towards the Mongols, who were actually very open to different religions. They were pretty tolerant when they wanted to be.
Was dazzled by the great Khan's fountain. It was a magnificent silver tree with silver serpents coiling around it. On its base there were 4 lions, also made of silver, each of them spewing forth mare's milk. From the branches of the tree, 4 pipes poured grape wine, fermented mare milk, rice beer and honey mead into basins for drinkers to enjoy. Back in medieval Europe, women were the primary brewers, and in England they were called alewives. As cities grew, alewives began making a profit from selling beer. Seeing this, men quickly decided that maybe they wanted to take over the brewing business. Unlike their wives.
Okay, and that happens throughout history. It's pretty shitty, if you ask me. It happens with the government a lot, yeah, but when men start seeing that women are being successful without their help, without male interference and male help, it's almost like, hey, I need to step in and regulate this, or I need to step in and give you a hand because, yeah, that's too much for you. No. Women have shown, and there's going to be a couple of videos I'm going to do about great women in history. Women have shown time and again that they do not need male help or interference. In fact, unless someone, no matter they're male, female, non-binary, it doesn't matter. Unless that person asks you for help, just stay back. Don't help. Unless they ask you for help. If you offer and they say sure, okay. If they say no, respect it. Okay. No problem.
Men could
I'll get off my soapbox now.
take out loans and set up guilds to protect their businesses and regulate the market in their favor.
We're all dressed the same way. That's embarrassing. That is pretty funny.
Between the 13th and 15th centuries, alewives were depicted with gross physical features, and some were even charged with witchcraft, which pushed alewives out of the beer business as men took over.
So yeah, and unfortunately that was pretty common whenever, because we got to remember that, especially when it comes to the terms of witchcraft and the accusations of witchcraft in the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and even as the colonial period in America began, a lot of it was stemmed from jealousy and trying to target somebody who was being successful, and in a sense, and most time it was women who were being successful, and the accuser wanted that success, or the accuser didn't think that success was deserved, or maybe the accuser, it was just jealousy. And so we see that a lot in history, how women who were, especially if they were working in a medicinal aspect, because a lot of times the person that you went to for medical treatment, especially if you're in a small village that didn't have, say, a doctor who was probably church or government sanctioned, or a barber who would handle a lot of medical things in history. Barbers actually did a lot of medical stuff. Would have been a woman who was probably older because she had experience, but she was also probably the midwife. She was the one who took care of if your child got a fever, if you had an infection. And then there were some of the more kind of private, what people might think would be embarrassing or shameful ailments that would come along, and she would quietly take care of those for you and help you with those. And of course, that would put a target on her because there might be jealous husbands or fathers or mothers or something. The church would put a target on them. So it would really was. You're taking, what you're trying to do is you're trying to shame, or you're trying to slander these very intelligent, experienced, and capable people, predominantly women, and by doing some kind of false accusation against them to push them out of a market. Whatever happened to them after that, you didn't care because, hey, now they're out of your market. Well, the unfortunate result was a lot of times these people were either banished, or worse, they were executed under these false pretenses. and it just was it's a very shameful thing. And I will point out that the church itself was not really backwards to the idea of medicine. The church was actually a strong proponent of medicine, but they were a strong proponent of medicine being taught or being taught and being practiced by men only. So a lot of these women who had this vast knowledge of medicinal properties of herbs or plants or the world and this vast experience were unable to go to the colleges. And very few of them, there were a few examples where they could, but very few could not, or mostly could not. And so that's, again, why they were kind of targeted, because how else would they know this stuff? Oh, they must have made some kind of deal. Like, no, it's because they're very intelligent. That's why they knew this stuff.
Up until the 13th century, beer was brewed with Groot, not that Groot, a combination of herbs and spices that added flavor and helped preserve the beer longer. So you didn't have to
And that monk looked drunk.
drink it as soon as it was fermented, like back in Samaria. Taxing Groot became an effective way to regulate and tax beer production.
And this is another example of the government stepping in and to try and make money off independent workers, independent sellers. You got to pay your taxes. Well, that's just another way the government steps in to make people pay for their own creations.
But Bavarians and Bohemians found an alternative to Groot, hops. Hops are these terrifying looking plants. They added bitterness and extra flavors to beer. But more importantly, hops were cheap, untaxed, and their antimicrobial effects preserved beer much longer than Groot could. The longer the beer lasts, the further it can travel. Some cities became major beer exports.
And that's why we got IPAs, India Pale Ales, because it was able to go to India with that much hops and bitterness. Interesting note, there were some actually some good government regulations to beer and taxes. Duke Wenceslaus, we call him King now, of Bohemia, from the good King Wenceslaus Christmas Carol fame, or St. Stephen's Carol fame, actually did create a law of beer regulation, kind of to regulate how beer was made and sold and taxed and everything. So there are some good regulations that came from the government. But in general, most taxes on what we create is bad as creators.
By the
Personal opinion.
1400s, the city of Hamburg had about 15 to 20,000 people, but was producing an average of 30 million litres of hopped beer per year. Laws were soon passed to regulate beer production, the most famous one being the 1516 Reinheitsgebot, or German purity law, saying the only ingredients allowed for making beer were barley, hops and water. Today, 500 years later, the Reinheitsgebot still influences how beer in Germany and the world is produced.
And this is similar to what we get in the culinary world a lot. Purity laws or what constitutes what is real beer. Okay, this is to them, this is real beer. Everything else is not, it's not the same. It's kind of like, it's very similar to saying, it's not champagne unless it comes from the Champagne region of France. Otherwise, it's just sparkling wine. It's not pizza unless it's from Napoli, the Napoli recipes of pizza. Things like it's similar in kind of the idea of what is truly the purest form of this particular thing.
In 1553,
And as a North Carolinian, we take a stand on barbecue. What is actually barbecue?
Bavaria passed a law forbidding brewing during the summer, saying that the weather would spoil the beer. Brewing started in March, and they would leave it to ferment in very cool caves until September, and so Märzenbier, or March beer, was born. In 1810.
Yeah, and the temperature that your beer ferments in, I've done some brewing in my life, not to the extent of a lot of other people that I know, but I have brewed successfully a few times. And what I've learned, one of the first lessons that you learn is that the temperature that your beer sits and ferments in, as they show the cool caves there, and I think Yingling still utilizes caves, like that really affects the outcome of the beer and the taste, and it can change the beers. If you're going to brew a lager, it's got to be fermented and sat in a cool place for a longer period of time. I think 65 degrees is the max you want to get it to. So things like that really impact how a beer is created.
There was a huge public party in honor of the wedding of Prince Ludwig of Bavaria and Princess Teresa. They had parades, horse races, and lots of beer.
Oktoberfest.
The wedding was in Munich in October, pairing perfectly with the opening of the Märzen beer barrels. It was such a massive success that they decided to repeat the celebrations every October, and it became known as March Beer Fest. No, it's Oktoberfest. Today,
And one of the things that I remember reading, and I have a friend that pretty much, I don't know if he still does, but he used to go to Oktoberfest every year in Munich. And I remember reading one time that Oktoberfest really started also as the ruler was seeing how, and throughout the rest of the world, revolutions were happening. And, we had famously the American Revolution, the French Revolution. He was seeing the Haitian Revolution. There was other revolutions happening against the Spanish Empire by that point. And so one thing to do to keep his people happy was, hey, I'm going to open the doors to this big ceremony, and we're going to let the common people celebrate with us, because it will show that we're part of the people. We're with them, and we're all together. So I don't know if that's 100% true. I remember reading that one time a few years ago when I used to be a part of a group that celebrated Oktoberfest, a local Oktoberfest. So it just one of those like kind of cool, neat history stories.
Oktoberfest runs from mid-September to October, and every year the Munich Oktoberfest attracts more than 6 million visitors.
I do not know how those guys can do that with those beers like that, but that is awesome.
More than 7 million litres of beer, a lot of that being Märzen beer. All the way on the other side of the ocean, at least since the 4th century BCE, Andean societies were brewing their own maize beers that today we call chicha. Andean women chewed the maize to start the fermentation process and then brewed the beer. Chicha was used to celebrate harvests, the new year, weddings, and funerals.
Yeah, and so part of what helps ferment the beer is their own saliva. So that's just a different way of adding that liquid component to the beer, or to the grains, or actually in this case corn. Like we know of from other societies, they would use a type of water, or I think in one it said milk, even. So just another aspect of just a different culture.
Funerals. They offered chicha to the sun, and during festivals they poured it over the ground because the gods always got the first sip. The Inca civilization uniquely functioned without currency or markets. The citizens paid taxes by giving their labor to the state, and they got all their basic necessities from state-owned warehouses. The empire hosted massive feasts with thousands of liters of chicha to repay the people for their service to the state. This Inca feasting economy created an insatiable demand for beer. In the Quechua language, the city of Cusco, the Inca capital city, was called Acamama, meaning chicha mother. The Inca Empire heavily invested in expanding maize production by opening up new areas to farm, creating colonies in fertile regions, and improving technology.
Yeah, and if you have never seen like an image like this of the terraced kind of city that the Incas could build in this very mountainous region, fertile region to an extent, if you could find, they terraced it and were able to irrigate it. Just the ingenuity that this culture had. And it just pisses me off when people sit there and say that there was no civilization here in the Americas prior to settlers, and because that's just bullshit. Yeah, and if you didn't know, I'm a historian that cusses a lot. So, you have the Incas, you have Aztecs, you have the Mayas building these great cities, you have the Mississippian cultures here in what is now the United States building these huge monumental cities that housed just as many people as London at that same time. and we're talking about in the 1400s, even further back, if not more people than the great cities of Europe. And the ingenuity that they had, because they did it without the same tools, but with a lot of the same. I mean, look at this, it's rocks. These are stones. These are large stones that they had to carve out and haul up mountains. So, there was a whole host of wondrous civilizations here in the Americas. So, anyone that says that the Americas were not civilized is a liar, and he's just speaking bullshit.
Maize production skyrocketed under the Inca, and their system of roads was so well developed they could easily distribute and store grain across their mountainous country, which was one of the largest empires on earth at the time.
Yep.
When the Spanish conquered the region, they tried to ban chicha production, but Andean women managed to keep it alive, and thanks to them, today you can sip this ancient drink across South America. In 18th century colonial America, during the Revolutionary War against Britain, American soldiers' daily rations included about 1 litre of beer, and in 1780, General Jorge Washington granted his troops their...
He said Jorge.
...one winter holiday, the 17th of March, to celebrate St. Patrick's Feast, probably because a considerable percentage of the army at the time was Irish. With the later mass migration of poor Irish people into America in the 19th century, St. Patrick's Day celebrations grew and grew. Today, more than half of the US population celebrates it. The city of Chicago even dyes its rivers green. In Ireland, we don't dye the rivers green, but there are parades, dances, drinking, and cultural events like Seacht na Gaeilge, or Irish Language Week. Worldwide, more than 13 million pints of Guinness, Ireland's famous stout beer, are served on St. Patrick's Day.
And I love Guinness. I really do. And it's just like drinking just a delicious liquid bread because it's so thick it can fill you up like a meal. I love that about beer because that's how beer traditionally was. He didn't mention it, and I should have mentioned it earlier, but beer in Egypt was oftentimes mixed with milk or other thicker substances to help fill you up because it just helped provide more of an appetite quencher for people.
Arthur Guinness was part of a group of pioneers that revolutionized brewing during the Industrial Revolution. He decided to open his own brewery at St. James's Gate in Dublin in 1759, signing a famous 9,000-year lease for £45 per year. Which is very annoying because I used to live right next door to this brewery and my rent was much higher than £45, and I had...
Okay, so let's just point out how much of a genius Arthur Guinness was for creating that, getting that lease, convincing somebody to make that lease possible. I really want to know if that's still in effect or if there was some kind of loophole that they could get out of it.
Had to smell the brewery. Guinness was an international success and was shipped all over the world. The first brewery opened abroad in 1963 in Nigeria, only 2 years after that country became independent. Guinness is so popular in Nigeria that some Nigerians think of Guinness as their national beer, and Nigeria is the world's second largest consumer of Guinness. In Ireland...
Okay, that's really cool. I actually never knew that, but I think that's really cool. Just shows you that something good can go across cultures and just bring people together. And food and things like that, the culinary world and culture can really bridge the gap between a lot of cultures. It really can. You break bread with people and you can learn a lot and really get that respect.
Up until recently, Guinness was associated with good health. For many years, doctors prescribed Guinness to post-operative patients, blood donors, and pregnant women, believing it was rich in iron. While industrial-scale brewing made Arthur Guinness and other factory owners rich, many workers were crushed by the industrial malt mill, drowned in beer vats, or asphyxiated by CO2 generated by fermentation. London had a deadly incident in 1814 when a 6.7 metre tall wooden vat filled with porter beer burst. The 500,000 litres beer tsunami flooded the neighbourhood and killed 8 people. But the Industrial Revolution didn't just affect...
Yeah, that happened more than one time. I don't know if it happened more than one time at Gibbs plant, but it happened in other plants too. And even I want to say it was in Boston or Baltimore. It was somewhere here on the East Coast in America, North America, that was it maple syrup did something very similar, or some kind of a syrup did something very similar too. And it was, you could say it was a learning process during the Industrial Revolution, but the safety measures that we have in place today are there for reasons. And unfortunately, we had to experience these horrific tragedies to learn how to be safer. And that's the unfortunate aspect about a lot of the safety regulations we have. If you really look at them and look at the history of them, you kind of go into these tragedies that happened.
Like the brewing process, it changed the palate too. During the Industrial Revolution, the deep, rich, heavy porters and stouts of the working classes were all the rage. But then, boom, imperialism. Tea and coffee took over Europe as they poured in from overseas colonies, and the emerging middle classes developed a taste for bitter drinks. Light and bitter pale beers rose in popularity. And then, imperialism strikes again. On the other side of the planet, the colonial British Indian Army waited impatiently in the Indian heat for their beer. Dark beers kept arriving stale and skunky. After 6 months of rocking back and forth at the bottom of a ship, I don't know what they expected. But then some companies tried sending paler beers packed with hops, which, as we have seen, are a powerful preservative. The beer was not very creatively called Indian Pale Ale, or IPA for short. Let's go to 19th century China and see what's going on.
Yeah, and that's one of the famous aspects about an Indian Pale Ale, and I'm not a big fan of those because of the bitter hoppiness. I've gotten developed a taste for some. There's some that I just can't. It's just like drinking a pine tree. But it really was a historical event that, you know, in a time when we couldn't ship things very quickly, you know, it created this new brand that was able to now survive and keep people happy.
Boom, imperialism striketh again. In 1897,
that's like the theme of like the last 300 years.
German naval troops went to the other side of the planet to seize the Chinese fort at Qingdao. The Germans built a village near the fort, and by 1903 it was attracting investors. Among them were the founders of Germania Brewery, which later became the Qingdao Brewery. In the beginning, Qingdao beer was brewed in accordance with German Reinheitsgebot, but after the company was privatized in the 90s, Qingdao started to add rice to the beer. Nowadays, Qingdao is the second largest brewery in China, with more than 17% of the domestic market and 4.4% of global beer production.
And I've had some of that beer. I didn't know that they actually did have the purity law beforehand, but I've had some of that beer. Obviously, it's over 100 years later, and it's really good. It is really good beer.
Germany also changed the beer history in another country. In the 19th century, Germans went to America by the hundreds of thousands. By the end of the century, there were an estimated 2.8 million Germans living in the US. Adolphus Busch was one of them. He partnered with Eberhard Anheuser to establish what would become the biggest beer company in the world, Anheuser-Busch. Busch made many improvements in beer production, including pasteurization and refrigeration. After a trip to Bohemia, the modern Czech Republic, he developed Budweiser, the biggest beer brand in the world, which kind of annoyed the Czechs, who already had a beer called Budweiser for about 800 years. The dispute between Budweiser and Budweiser is why the American Budweiser is just called Bud in Europe. Today, Anheuser-Busch sales exceed $52 billion a year, nearly 30% of the world market. By the end of the 19th century,
and that's the gross domestic product of Panama. Wow.
drunkenness was becoming a social problem in the United States, and the Americans reacted harshly. From 1920 until 1933, alcoholic beverages were outlawed across the US. Companies that had made fortunes in the decades before were struggling to survive, selling anything from malt extract and tonics to ice creams. When Prohibition ended and the market picked up again after the end of World War II, almost all small breweries had died out. Beer brewing was now in the hands of gigantic corporations. Beer corporations became masters of the new science of marketing, and soon TV sets were filled with beer advertisements and refrigerators were stocked with cold beer that was cheap, bottled, mass-produced, and mass-marketed.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that my dad will always tell me is that he remembers the Hamm's beer commercial from, I think, the 50s and 60s, which had a bear, a dancing bear. So they did the gimmicks, the marketing employees. You saw, I remember in the 80s, we had the dog. I can't remember what beer that was, but it was Spuds McKenzie or something. That might have been from a cartoon, but there was a dog that used to come out. I think it was with Bud Light, things like that. So yeah, you had that as well. And yeah, it was cheap. Beer was cheap. I remember being able to go, even just 20 some years ago, go to the store at my college and get a 6-pack of beer for like $2.50. Now you're probably paying $10 for a 6-pack of beer. You know, and I'm sure he's going to go into why that is, and I have a theory.
In the last 20 years, small breweries have made a comeback, brewing their own unique beers. Beer drinkers can now enjoy beer of all flavors. You can even drink a beer.
And this is one reason why the beer prices have gone up, is because now there's more brewers.
Called Gilgamesh, based on the earliest beers brewed in Sumeria. Since 2010, an average of 190 billion litres of beer have been produced every year. It is the most consumed beverage on earth after water and tea. And each time a pint is raised to welcome friends, to wish good health, to toast a new marriage, or to remember lost loved ones, it is an act that has been repeated by humans every single day for the last 10,000 years. Today maybe we don't believe beer connects us with the gods, but there is still some magic in it. Although, if you still want to use beer to feel connected to the gods again, you can head to Guatemala and share a cigarette or beer with Maximon, a Maya folk saint. Evan from the channel Rare Earth did just that in this video over on Nebula. Nebula is a video streaming platform that Cogito and a bunch of our creator friends have built.
All right, so I guess he's going to do his promotion. That's cool. I'll leave that up there, because I have checked out Curiosity Stream. It's kind of cool. I am not paid by them though, so that was just my personal opinion. Yeah, so beer has been essential to history in a lot of ways. People will tell you, and historically this wasn't always true. It was in some areas, but people will tell you that beer was safer to drink than water. You know, because that depends on where you get your water from. If you were getting your water from a drinking well that was deep underground from groundwater, your water was pretty safe. Apart from it was pretty safe to drink. I wouldn't let, there could be some contaminants depending on how close it was to other things, such as factories. But for the most part, if you got your water from a drinking well, your water was safe. If you went to the creek right outside town, no, it wasn't going to be safe. So yeah, beer was safer than that, because beer was fermented, and so that's why a lot. And there is, people will tell you that here in America, in the United States, we drank beer for breakfast. Well, there's some truth to that as well. Again, it all depended on your water source and the fermentation process. One thing that they didn't touch on was that in Mexico, a lot of the German immigrants also brought their beer recipes there. That's why some of the beer recipes that you get from Mexico have that German style. In fact, one of them is called Bohemia, which is, Bohemia. But it's pronounced Bohemia. And it's a really good beer, but it's a German beer. It's a German style beer, but it's from Mexico because of the immigration. So we have a lot of that too. Like I said earlier, the culinary world can really bridge a lot of cultures together, and we should really celebrate that more than what we do. And so I hope you like this. Remember, check out my book, Scorned. We do talk a lot about, we talk some about beer. There is some beer in there. There's wine, mead especially. But the other thing that is there's strong female representation in a lot of my books, because in history, and I'm going to do a video on it. I'm trying to find a really good one. That history is full of really strong, intelligent women. We should celebrate that. We should learn about them, and we should really just recognize and acknowledge that we would not be where we are as a human race without strong women with us. Our mothers, our grandmothers, our sisters, our daughters, friends, we would not be here without them. Wives, whatever you want to say. So check out my books, like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.